So what should we call this series? I don't know. How about a world on fire? Yeah, that'll do. Hey there, and welcome to my channel. When one thinks of ancient wars, they probably think of conflicts in Europe like the Peloponnesian War or Rome's conquest of the Mediterranean. But sometimes we forget that hundreds of thousands of miles away across the sea, another type of conflict was occurring. Conflicts over territory in the Americas, Africa, and Asia, which, while not known by us today, were just as important in shaping the modern world. And this is especially true of the 7 Years' War, which, despite happening so long ago, still has massive repercussions in our world today. So let's explore the causes, key moments, and consequences of this often forgotten conflict. Now, the period of time before the French Revolution was known as the Age of Enlightenment, but that doesn't mean that these decades were particularly peaceful. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Throughout this era, there was constant warfare and conflict all across the globe, and in many ways, the 7 Years' War was merely a culmination of all of this prior tension. Now, while it is called the 7 Years' War, it actually lasted for 9 years from 1756 to 1763, although in reality, different regions were affected at different times. At its core, the war was a struggle between two rival European coalitions. On the one side, we had Great Britain and Prussia against France, Austria, Russia, Sweden, and Saxony. There was also a lot of colonial fighting as well, with various Native American tribes allied with both sides. So why did all of these nations go to war? Well, the answer is pretty simple. Land and power. Each nation involved in the conflict wanted more power and land either in Europe or in their respective colonies. Now, the war was most intense in Europe, where Prussia found itself vastly outnumbered. Despite this, the small German state of Prussia managed to hold off the combined armies of France, Austria, and Russia for 6 straight years. This unlikely feat was achieved under the leadership of the brilliant Prussian general Frederick the Great. One of his most decisive victories came at the Battle of Leuthen in 1757. Here, Frederick positioned his troops cleverly to take advantage of a wheat field and managed to outmaneuver and defeat the larger Austrian force. Although the battle was tactically brilliant, it didn't really change much as the war continued on without any side being able to gain an upper hand. Now, the war wasn't only fought in Europe, as both Britain and France used the conflict as an opportunity to expand their colonial empires. Over in North America, the war would be known as the French and Indian War. Now, up until this point, the colonial holdings of Britain and France were largely separate. However, as the century progressed, both powers began encroaching further west, leading to clashes over territory. By the mid-1700s, there were several areas of contention. One was the Ohio River Valley, which was claimed by both the British and the French. Another was the Canadian colony of New France, which the British hoped to conquer. To achieve this, the British would form an alliance with a number of Native American tribes, most notably the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, the war in North America started out poorly for the British, as the French were able to inflict a number of early defeats on them. This was largely because the French had strong alliances with the Native Americans, who helped them launch surprise attacks and raids. However, the British eventually turned the tide thanks to a massive influx of troops and supplies from Britain itself. Using superior numbers, the British were slowly able to push the French back. By 1760, they had taken the city of Montreal. The final French stronghold of Quebec City fell the following year, and with that, New France was conquered. While the war in Europe continued for another 3 years, the situation in North America effectively ended with the British victory at Quebec. Across the Atlantic, Britain was carving out an empire in India. The British East India Company had been given a charter by Queen Elizabeth I in 1600. Its purpose was to trade with the East Indies. However, over the course of the next 150 years, the company gradually took on more and more military responsibilities, and by the mid-1700s, it essentially functioned as a second government in India. The 7 Years' War in India was fought between the British on one side and the French, the Kingdom of Mysore, and the Kingdom of Bengal, among others, on the other side. The war began with a French invasion into southern India, but it soon became clear that they were no match for the British. Robert Clive was a British commander who played a major role in winning the war for the East India Company. His most famous victory came at the Battle of Plassey in 1757. Here, Clive's small British force defeated a much larger army of the Nawab of Bengal, essentially ending French hopes of dominating India. Following their defeat at Plassey, the French would make no further attempts to conquer India and instead focus their efforts on Canada and the Caribbean. In hindsight, the conquest of India proved to be far more consequential than the colonial conflicts elsewhere, as it laid the foundation for British domination of the subcontinent. As the 1760s rolled around, it was clear that neither side could achieve a decisive victory. Eventually, both sides decided to seek peace. The war would conclude with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1763. For Britain, the treaty went about as well as they could have hoped. They gained vast amounts of territory in North America, including the entire region east of the Mississippi River. They also acquired sugar-rich Guadeloupe, as well as the important port of Havana in the Caribbean. Meanwhile, France lost almost all of its territorial holdings in North America. In India, they lost territories to the British as well and were forced to pay a large sum of money to Britain to cover the costs of the war. While France lost significant amounts of territory, it wasn't exactly a good deal for Britain either. That is, because they had spent a ton of money fighting the war and were now saddled with the cost of defending and administering a vast amount of new territory. This led directly to the end of the 7 Years' War. So what was the significance of the conflict? Why should we care about this war that happened so long ago? Well, first of all, it was the first true world war in that it was fought across the globe, from Europe to North America to India to Africa and Australia. Secondly, the war solidified Great Britain's position as the dominant global naval and colonial power, setting the stage for the massive British Empire of the 19th century. And thirdly, the war demonstrated the waning of French power. France went from being the largest colonial power in the world to losing almost all of its territory outside of Europe. Alright, now it's time for you to make your voice heard. Comment below and tell me if you think Britain was right to take French territory, or if you think the Treaty of Paris was unfair to France. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And to help out the channel, leave a like or comment. I'll see you next time.